Happy 2022, everyone. Welcome to OUP's first webinar of the year. I'm Kirsten Loita of Osage University Partners, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar is a session that is an overview of pitching by academic startups to investors. I'm very pleased to be joined by two of my terrific investment colleagues, Margalit Haber and Ajay Rayasam today, and I'm going to have them start out by introducing themselves. Ajay, do you want to start?
Yeah, nice to meet everyone. My name is Jay. I'm on the tech side. Recently graduated from MIT with a dual degree from Bristol Business School and School of Engineering with a focus on product design and development. Previously, I spent about 5 years in an early stage startup as a chief of staff for an enterprise software company. Grew that from $0 to $2 million AR, and excited to help researchers commercialize their projects.
Thanks, Ajay. Margalit?
Hi, everyone. So Margalit Haber, I'm an associate on the life science investment team here at OUP. My background is I have a PhD in neurobiology. Prior to OUP, I was a postdoc at Penn doing clinical research in neuroimaging, and then I spent a bit of time in the life science startup and biotech community in Philadelphia and joined OUP just over 2 years ago now. So nice. Thanks all for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you to our audience for being here today. Thank you, Margalit and Ajay, for providing this presentation. Just as some logistics before we get into the actual presentation itself, we will provide the slides and a recording of this webinar to all the people who have registered for this afterwards. We also will have the webinar available on our partner portal, which is available to the tech transfer offices we work with, as well as on our YouTube channel. So for those of you who don't know, who are in the tech transfer field, we do maintain an online portal for our partner universities that is full of relevant tech transfer content. Once you are on that site, you will find this under the startup resources section of that portal. So we do encourage everyone who is attending today to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A box on the toolbar of Zoom in order to do so rather than the chat function. The Q&A feature really helps me track the questions and be able to ask them of Ajay and Margalit as we go through the presentation. Our webinar today will be divided into three unequal sections. First of all, making the pitch, approaching investors. Second, frameworks for evaluation of investment opportunity, and third, the elements of a pitch deck. So I'm going to have Margalit start us off.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So we're just going to start by going through a few slides to sort of just help you better understand the investors you're pitching to. We find the presentations are just always better if you understand your audience, right? So we're going to try and help you better understand these investors. So this slide goes through some different sources of capital that startups are raising from. On the left side, we have the investor type, and on the right gives you a sense of the function that these investors provide. So at the very bottom, many early startups that we're looking at from the universities are getting grants. These are non-dilutive sources of capital, which means you don't give up any equity to get this type of funding, right? Some companies are able to scale their whole business on these. Then after that are the friends and family. So very early stage startups sometimes have a network of friends and family they can raise an initial round of financing from. We actually did a webinar highlighting tips for doing friends and family rounds. So please check out our channel for more on that. Angels and accelerators. So this is when you get to the point where you feel like you need to get a couple key de-risking experiments or tasks done. That's when angels and accelerators become very helpful. They'll take on very early stage technologies with lots of risk and give them small pool funds to get a few key milestones complete. And they'll generally expect some equity in return. So venture capital. So that's when you're ready to sort of scale your business. That's when VC dollars really become helpful, right? So VC funds will allow you to inject a lot of capital into your business to grow quickly. VCs are only willing to invest in a company if they see a 5 to 10x return within a 5 to 10 year time frame. And so, things to keep in mind, VC dollars are dilutive, so they'll expect a substantial amount of equity for the amount of money they're providing, and the risk they're taking, and the equity that they usually comes along with some control provisions as well, and liquidity preference. So it's not a cheap source of capital. And then strategics are large corporations that you can partner with or will eventually consider acquiring your business. So generally, later stage businesses will start looking to strategic capital to continue to grow the business. Next slide. So with regards to VC capital, how many companies actually go out and raise VC dollars? The amount of deals closed is actually very small in relation to the number of deals considered. VCs are looking at hundreds of opportunities for a single investment. So at OUP in particular, we track about 7,000 companies and make about 40 investments in a single fund. That ends up being less than 1% acceptance rate. So it's important to keep in mind that this is a highly competitive process. You need to make sure your company stands out amongst the rest. Next slide. So how do you even start that conversation with a potential investor or VC and make it to the top of the pile? So we always recommend getting an intro if you can. Warm introductions get better responses than cold emails. Ask around your network to see who they know, if they can provide you an intro. And then the next thing that will make you stand out is having a very clear, well-organized, and impactful pitch deck. We'll go into the details of what that deck looks like later in the talk, but the key points to hit in that initial non-con pitch deck: you should discuss who you are. Are you the premier scientist in your field? Do you have any relevant experience to run a startup? It should have data that justifies your enthusiasm for this technology and address why that data is compelling in relation to the competitive landscape. You also want to cover addressable market as well with regards to how big the opportunity is within realistic bounds. And then finally, what your ask is. So how much money do you need and what will you accomplish with it? Okay, move on. Next slide. So one thing to note is that you should always play to your strengths when pitching to VCs. We get pitched by both entrepreneurs and founding scientists. So when an entrepreneur is pitching us, we expect them to have a good grasp of the market and where this product fits in, the fundraising plan, long-term strategy of the company, and how to develop this product. Also, team is such a large part of why we make an investment. So we expect the entrepreneur to lead with the team. Why are they the best person to bring this technology to the market? And who else around them can help them do that? So if a scientist is pitching us, we don't expect them to come to us with sort of a complete business plan and commercialization strategy, but we do expect them to know the science really well and know how their particular innovation fits into the competitive landscape. So who else is working in the space and why is your technology better? The other thing we expect from a founding scientist is loads of data to support your approach, and then end with what the next steps are, like what key experiments you think need to be done and how long do you think it will take to get done. Next slide. So these bullets were taken from an article on the LifeSci VC blog. The article was written by the CFO and head of Corp Dev at Unam Therapeutics. She runs through lessons learned from fundraising. So the key points to really remember is when you are targeting investors, you want to pay attention to their investment strategy, stage, and fund availability. So if you're a med device company, it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time trying to talk to VCs who primarily focus on oncology therapeutics, right? Also, the fundraising process is long. We tell folks fundraising typically takes several months and possibly up to a year. So when you're an early stage company, you're telling a new story to investors, and they will require time to get comfortable with the story. So expect lots of meetings and be prepared for rejection. VCs say no a lot more than they say yes. Fundraising is a lot of work and can take a lot of time. So there's an option to outsource the process to private placement agents. We don't generally recommend this for early stage companies because the founders will still need to spend a lot of time talking to investors and the investors want to talk to the founders. It's difficult to get comfortable with a new story unless the founders are directly speaking to it. So sharing their enthusiasm and going through those details with us. Next slide.
Actually, we have a quick question, Margalit. So it says, when sending an initial email, should it include the attached pitch deck, or is it better to share a high-level email to ensure interest and then follow up with the attachment without risks of spam filters focused on attachments?
That's a good question. I like having the deck as well as an overview in the email. Of course, there is the risk based on whatever their settings are in their inbox that it will filter to spam if you have an attachment, but I think it's better to have additional information in that email if you can. Because it's one extra piece of information you're providing to the VC without them having to go back and ask you for it, which is an additional step that they might not take, right? So if the pitch deck is truly has some additional information about your company that you really can't capture in like a summary email, I think it's nice to have it in the email. Ajay, being the tech person, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. It saves us an extra step in communication. And I don't think that they would, the individual, reject you based on the document itself. I think it has to do with the theme, what they're looking at, what their interests are, regardless. So I don't think you decrease your chances by doing that. I think if anything, it just shows thoughtfulness because we do have limited time. And so typically the follow-up question before another conversation is, can I see your deck? And I take a look at it. And so that'll save us time and we would appreciate it.
I don't think I actually have many think from potential entrepreneurs that have gone to my spam or my other folder. You could always follow up again, but I mean, I
think that's the point. The point there is also about genericism. Like if it actually is directed towards you and you can, it doesn't seem like it's a mass email, then it tends not to go to the spam filter.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thank you very much for your answers to that question.
So then on this slide, we go through some of the different investors and the stages that they look at, right? And so this is specifically for life science at the moment. So the really company formation, that first stage that we have listed, is taking some very basic science, just the IP, and turning it into a startup, putting management around it, so on and so forth. So Third Rock, Atlas, they tend to do a bunch of that type of activity. OUP is very broad in its focus. We tend to get involved when a company has already been formed, but we are looking at some more company formation type opportunities at the moment. But the majority of our investment focus has been when a company is formed, maybe there's one or two people around the table managing it. And then we go as far as crossover fundraisers. Being a traditional VC fund, though, we invest primarily in private companies and private rounds. Alternatively, crossover investors, these hybrid private capital, private equity, and hedge funds, they invest in both private and public companies. So they typically get involved in around prior to an IPO and then invest in public markets as well. These funds traditionally got involved much later in a startup's life, but we're finding that given the boom in biotech and so the turn for so many of these companies to go public much earlier, a lot of the crossover investors have actually been looking at earlier preclinical companies now as well. Next slide. Then I'll turn over to Ajay to go through tech VCs.
Yeah, similarly in the tech side, the lines are blurred. So more and more companies are investing earlier at the company formation level, especially in software. But a good next step for you to think about as you consider your journey in approaching investors is most of my friends go to Y Combinator, or they apply to Techstars, or they go to their local university accelerator program. At MIT, there's Delta V. I'm sure there's equivalent at your institutions. And really, that's just to help you identify customers and refine the business model and pitch. And it helps you get exposure to later stage investors if you go to a Y Combinator or Bolt, et cetera. And as I mentioned, the lines are blurred over time. And so many investors like Sequoia, et cetera, are building funds to invest in seed stage level. So as Margalit mentioned, OUP is kind of across the funnel. So we're looking at earlier stage of opportunities, but we're not opposed to investing in Series A and beyond. Go to the next slide. Great. So I'm going to briefly provide an overview of how to come up with your pitch, and then we'll all transition to the how to build the deck itself. Next slide, please. So I think the most important thing is to create a framework of how to represent your idea. So I think on Reddit, there's something called explain it like I'm five. And I think that's the best advice. So explain your idea to someone who has no technical background. Typically, I'm looking at hundreds of pitches as well. We have limited time. We have half an hour to an hour discussion. So I need to understand what you're trying to accomplish as fast as possible. And so typically that means just trying to eliminate the jargon involved. That way I can follow, because there's no way I would be an expert in your field unless I spent many years in that particular area. So for example, in software, AI, ML, probably up to speed, but if you're in quantum computing, I probably need a little bit more time to understand. And so this is a great framework, this slide here, just to think through your pitch. So what are the risks? How much are the costs? Who cares? And I think it's a great way to keep it simple. And complexity doesn't help make your pitch better. I think the easier it is to understand, the more we can get to the questions that really matter and go towards our diligence process. Next slide, please. And so here's some more tips. I think it's important. I think the key takeaway from this slide is be transparent. As we dig into the company and we learn more, we're going to have questions. And so it's really important to address any perceived weaknesses and to look at your company from an objective measure. So perhaps you don't have the experience, you didn't have, successful exit before. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but you can prove that, feeling otherwise. So maybe you've shown traction, you've recruited a great team, you've assembled a great advisor board. Just think about it from an objective measure. And more practically, slides that are really nice, that are visually pleasing, tend to capture attention a little bit more because we do look at thousands of slides. So we just want to quickly be able to understand what your story is, essentially. Less words is better. You can follow up with research papers, information otherwise within a data room, which we can discuss as well. And throughout the conversation, so I would, instead of just focusing on pitch and telling your story, I would try to make it as much of a conversation as possible, because ultimately, at the end of the day, people invest in people, people buy from people, and it's about a relationship on two sides. Next slide, please. So we're going to go over the elements of the pitch deck. And there's no standard way of doing this. This is just one example. Sequoia has their own framework. I'm sure there's many frameworks online as well. But as I mentioned, think of it as telling a story, and you're trying to capture our attention and to understand exactly what you're building and why it's a big opportunity. Because ultimately we're investors and we have a fiduciary obligation to find attractive opportunities to return to our limited partners. And so the most simplest way is to quickly go through your problem solution, tell us who you are, what your background is, the market opportunity, the technology and product, who are you competing against, the operational plan, and the finance strategy. I wouldn't worry too much about the finance strategy, how much money you make. It's more about the thought process and how you think about it, because we do ultimately know that things change over time. And so in the coming slides, what we're going to do is we're going to go through each slide individually. And then please, the next slide as well. Thank you. And as I mentioned, you want to capture our attention. It's like when you're writing a paper, you want to capture, you have a hook. It's like, what is the big idea? In one sentence or two sentences, can you summarize what exactly you're trying to accomplish? In this example, this is one of our portfolio companies, Core Light. The great challenge: access and analyze a clone of real-time data to detect, understand, and prevent breaches. I'm immediately thinking, what is that? What does that mean? I want to learn more. And that's exactly what you want to get across. You want to capture attention. It seems like a big idea. Why should I spend more time with it? What are you doing? Who's behind it? That's essentially what you're trying to do. It's you're capture, and this takes a long time to synthesize whatever you're working on for 3 to 6 months, in a simple few sentence manner. And it's not an easy way of doing it, but it'll show your thought as you come away with these like bullet points. And so other examples are Kensai, risk prediction for healthcare, powered by machine learning, quantum circuits, develop, manufacture, and sell the first general purpose quantum computers. As I mentioned, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just about capturing our attention, just so we can quickly categorize what you're doing. So for quantum series, I know it's a quantum computing company. For the first one, I know it's a cybersecurity company. So I have a different frame of reference for it.
And then, so some of these slides, we sort of have we have a tech example and a life science example. So on the right, we have a life science example. And this is highlighting a slightly different version of an introductory slide, but it's also capturing the same idea. You're really giving an overview of who you are. And so this one has like a few more details, right? So things that I would like to know right off the bat and from that first slide. So stating the problem. So who are you trying to help and what the pitfalls are? some details about why your solution is optimal in relation to everything else being tried, and then outlining sort of the current stage of the technology and what that development timeline looks like right up front. All of that is very helpful. It's just a preview of what you're going to talk to later on. It's just a means of introducing everything that you're doing sort of in a quick little elevator pitch / summary in the beginning.
Should I go to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, we do have a question, but I actually think it may be good to ask actually towards the end of these particular slides. And the one thing I did want to mention actually as we go to the next slide is just that we're actually providing slides from actual decks here, but we've actually talked with companies and they've allowed us to show these slides, but we want people to see actually what these slides look like so they get an idea of what we see when companies are pitching to us. So I apologize. Ajay, please.
Yeah, no problem. It's a great segue. And so the most important aspect of any pitch or any conversation is the team itself. We're ultimately investing in you, especially in the earlier stage where there isn't much of a product, there isn't much of sales attraction. And so this may be the most important slide to understand, why you're working on why are you uniquely qualified to work on whatever problem you're trying to solve. And so this slide is essentially trying to substantiate your claim as being a deep expert in this field or having some kind of unique insight. So I think it's important to also show the construction of the team. What we look for is a balanced team. So if the CEO has a focus on the technical aspects, what we'd love to see them surrounding by someone with commercial expertise. And for anyone in venture capital, the more expertise you have, or if you have if you started a company before, it makes us more comfortable, as well as, have you worked with your teammates for many years? Have you worked on many projects? Because that also de-risks from our standpoint, it de-risks the investment because we know that you've worked well together. You've successfully completed projects. It doesn't necessarily need to mean a startup, but you've worked well. And I mentioned the fact that, sometimes many of you may be first-time founders, and that's okay. Maybe you can demonstrate how you've been entrepreneurial in the past and who you work with for, what companies you work for. And ideally, it's relevant for whatever you're trying to solve.
And would you like to say something?
No. Please go through, and I have a couple questions, I think so.
Sure. So then on the for life science companies, I'd like to highlight that not every company we see has a management team, right? And also on the tech side, but we see this a lot in life sciences from the universities that we speak to, and that's okay. If it's a company of all scientists, we want to see a slide that highlights sort of the background of the scientists involved, faculty position, expertise in what areas. Have they been involved in developing a drug before? Did they consult for pharma or a startup? All of that is relevant information. And then if there is a management team, as Ajay highlighted, we want to know about previous positions that they're relevant to the current startup. I think in the example here, we show the different companies that these members of the team have been a part of. And any pharma positions are relevant for therapeutics companies. Any previous venture-backed companies are also relevant to put on there. Even if they didn't do well, it shows us that they know how to raise capital from VCs, which is critical for future fundraising. So really anything that just highlights relevant experience to what the company is doing going forward, which could be very broad. So, Kristen.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions about companies that are still small. Basically, one person says, so when you're raising that seed round and you're dealing with this management team or a slide, do you need more than one full-time person at the pre-seed seed round, or do you expect maybe you're mainly showing, for example, scientific co-founders, et cetera?
Can you repeat that last part?
Well, so when you if you don't have full-time employees, right? Because you're so early stage. How do you show this kind of slide at that point? At this point of the of pitching.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen team members. So I've seen founders include them, but just clearly note that they're part-time for now. They're hoping to transition upon receiving funding. I think that's acceptable because it shows that you have the foresight to see, understand who you're trying to recruit. And we also understand that not everyone can afford or have the opportunity to work full time and have a lower salary. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is to count them as advisors and say that they're open to transitioning to a full-time role. I think, indicating that is understandable, especially at the pre-seed stage or seed stage. It makes sense, and we've seen that before.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add to, like, if it's a scientist, faculty member who's not planning to be a part of the company, totally fine. I would put your face and your name and those scientific co-founders on a slide, talk about their expertise and why it's relevant to this underlying technology and approach that they're taking, and just be upfront about the fact that, like, these people are not going to be full-time at the company. They are going to stay as faculty, and we are looking to recruit management. I think everyone being on the same page with regards to, like, who the team's going to be going forward is really important, and it's good to get that out at the beginning. Doesn't count against the startup at all.
And there's a couple questions about, where people are kind of this is my first time, being CEO. Maybe I don't have the background in this. That's where a lot of startups obviously start. What do you advise for this type of slide then in those cases? And how can they gain trust, without having perhaps that background yet? For example, is it bringing in advisors in this, showing consultants that are helping out with the company, programs that they've been involved with?
Yeah, all the above. So I think demonstrating an interest in entrepreneurship, even if you founded something that's totally unrelated, showing that you're part of the clubs, you're part of the ecosystem, shows that you're committed and passionate about it. Another way is, as you mentioned, like showing advisors, like what a big part of being an entrepreneur is recruiting other people and having them believe in your vision. And that just supports that, even without the proven success, that, hey, you're able to captivate other people's attention, and they respect and believe in what you're trying to build. And so those are other ways. I mean, there's probably examples of first-time founders being wildly successful. It doesn't necessarily hold you back, but those are the ways that I can think about overcoming that.
Yeah.
Great.
Agreed.
And one last thing, how do you view startups where the inventor is the CEO? I know you touched on this a little bit, but just in general.
So from the tech side, I think it depends. It depends at the stage, though, and the particular product that you're focused on. Sometimes you need the CEO to be the product manager at the early stage and to have that expertise, because maybe that individual is the only one in the world that can execute at that stage. And the needs of a company grow over time. And so the management team that starts off as the company isn't always there for the IPO round or Series A round. It evolves over time. I think there's very few individuals that can sort of have transferable skills or be open-minded to different roles. Like the role of the CEO at that stage is different from public-facing company CEO whose job is to keep the stock price up. And so I think just having awareness of what your skills are and where more importantly, like where you want to play and how long you want to be involved in the company, I think shows a great amount of awareness, or even the willingness to learn the different skills or what's required at each stage. And so it's not limiting. It's really a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and on the life science side, I'd say we look for CEOs who are very technically knowledgeable in that space, like know the therapeutic they're using, know the device they're developing, know the clinical indication well, very focused on the biology and the science, but also have that eye to what the development trajectory looks like. That is a rare thing to find in a single individual in general. And so sometimes in the early stages, if the inventor of the technology is the right person to do then that's totally fair, and that makes sense. I think to Ajay's point, to just be self-aware enough to know when the right time would be to maybe bring on somebody else at a different stage of the company is all we'd really look for, to somebody who's not so committed to being the CEO and the top dog at that company that they're not willing to step aside if the company requires another person to run it at that point. And so I think that's totally fine. And again, a lot of the times the inventor is the expert in that field, right? And so highlight that you are the expert, highlight that you work with you collaborate with the other experts in the field. All of that is relevant information and builds a good case for why you're the right person to take that forward.
Yeah, and I want to add, and that's a conversation that you have with your investors as a team. It's a partnership that goes both ways, and that's something that you discuss over time.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next, I will go to the next slide. I think we're out of questions now for this section.
Great. And so ultimately, venture capitalists are looking for a large return, and to justify that return, we're looking for startups that are focused on targeting large opportunities. So think of $500 million TAM plus. The reason why is there's very, very few markets out there that's winner takes all. And so more than likely, you're going to be competing with a number of companies. And so you have to be able to scale. The company doesn't necessarily need to go public, but it needs to scale to a large extent for us to get a return on our investment for our investors. And so this is a really important slide, justifying the market opportunity. And what I've noticed personally is that most founders focus on the top-down approach. So they go to market research firms like Gartner, et cetera, get this really big number. This TAM is $20 billion for transportation engineering in this case. And that's not always the actual value. It's a top-down approach. And so what I really advise, which is what I do for as an associate, for each deck that I see, I try to get a bottoms-up calculation, which means what are the actual revenue? What are customers actually willing to pay? And multiply that the total potential number of customers, and then a portion of that is what you can actually obtain. And so we're going to do the calculation anyway. So I think it would be helpful if you could do it on your own and get an estimate. So through user interviews, through NSF Foundation grants, you can talk to users and get a good ballpark figure of how much they're willing to pay for. And it also may save you time as well. If you want to create a venture-backed company, if you want to create a large company, then maybe it could help you refocus the appropriate market and to find the right space that'll be worth your time if that's the path that you want to go down. I think next slide. Market opportunity. This is a really subjective idea. I think it's more about investors understanding why this particular moment is the right moment. And so what we're looking is just for the logic of why it's really hard to figure out timing. And so these are assumptions that may not be accurate, but I think you're trying to create a sense of urgency of why this moment may be different. Like, for example, why is it clean tech 2.0? Or in this case, Moore's law, for a semiconductor company, what are the trends, the macro and micro trends that are leading to make this decision for you to forgo whatever job opportunities that you have or research opportunities you have for this particular idea. And so what we're looking for is just the justification on top of the large market opportunity, why, what factors influence this particular moment for your technology to take off. And it's more, as I mentioned, you don't necessarily have to be correct, but it's more about understanding the logic behind your decision.
I'll add that we ask this a lot when we're making an investment. Why now? Why is now the right time to invest in this company, in this technology, in this idea? On the life science side, we're looking for, was there some truly paramount discovery that happened recently? Is there a better understanding of this clinical indication that makes the clinical trials easier to go through? Can we stratify patients better? Things like that. And then also, do we just understand the biology more? Do we understand the structure of the protein target better so we can design a better drug? What is it really that is creating this large opportunity right now at the moment? And then I'll just also add on life science for market opportunity, certain indications that are pretty popular, we will know what the market opportunity is, and you don't have to really go into a lot of detail with regards to that in the pitch. So like triple negative breast cancer, for example, if you're developing a therapeutic for that, don't have to go into a lot of detail. But if you're developing a therapeutic or device for like a rare disease or an orphan disease indication, you might want to add a little bit more about that. about the prevalence if it's a chronic treatment or incidence if it's acute. Really good to highlight what other indications your technology can be expanded into as well, since that expands your market if it is something like a rare disease or something like that. So it's just some specific life science points for market opportunity as well. Next slide.
Great. And this is an important slide as well. It's describing what is being done in the area of the market that you're targeting currently. And it gives us, like, as an investor, a frame of reference. So, what is being done today? And the next slide, which we'll go over, is like, what are you doing that's different? And is it a step change? And so, for example, in this slide, we're talking about sensors, IoT sensors, which are consuming way too much power. And so it's giving us a frame of reference for what is that problem, and what are other companies doing it right now, and is there truly an advantage? Is there a competitive advantage, a unique advantage that you're creating with your solution? And so I think if you have examples, if you have videos, if you have a software, if you can have like screenshots of what you've done and what's going on in the market and what you've done, that's really helpful for us to understand what you're building as fast as possible. Next slide, please. Great. And this is just a continuation, as I mentioned before. So in this case, one of our portfolio companies has redefined IoT sensors. They created ultra low power sensors. So they're addressing the previous problem. And so it's clearly, hey, there's a need. This is a huge market opportunity. This is what's being done currently, and this is why we're better, and this is what's different. And so ideally, what we're looking is for a step change, something that's 10x faster, 10x cheaper, because it has to have a true competitive advantage in order for it to sell in the market. We tend to focus on, and most investors tend to focus on, step changes, especially in particular in deep tech. And so there has to be a compelling reason or problem that you're solving, and significantly better, especially on the tech side. And if you know this information, it depends on the stage. Who are your customers? Who are your end users? Is it a patient? Is it a bank, payer, bank? The more information you can describe of who's willing to pay, the economic buyers, what we call it, the better, the more substantiation that you can have for your idea. Next slide, please. Especially in the university ecosystem space, we want you to justify the solution. Let's assume that it's a spin out based on your research. Well, what kind of evidence do you have to support it? You may not have a functional prototype at this stage, and that's okay. But what supports those ideas? What research? What has captured the attention of others? And Margalit can talk about the life science side.
Yeah, for life science, any key data. So anything published in a poster, in a patent, anything that is relevant and exciting should go into your non-con. Some folks include non-published data in their non-con, but you don't, in your non-confidential deck, but you don't have to really. If it's published in a poster or in a patent, that's what I tell people is fair game, because all of that is easily accessible by anyone. But really, you're trying to build a case for why your approach is better and more exciting than everything else out there. So you really need to show what's the data supporting this approach, and why should I believe that it's better and more exciting. And so think carefully about what really are the key data elements that need to go into your deck.
So I'm going to interject with a few questions. First of all, we keep getting a lot of comments and people asking for the slides. As we mentioned before, yes, we are going to be sending out the slides to everyone who registered. People can also write into us and ask us for them. This presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as our partner portal. And then we have a couple of questions on the therapeutic side, Margalit. So one is on therapeutics, how much preclinical data do you need? Is animal data a must? Because lead optimization is very costly in academia and hard to justify.
Yeah. It's a good question. Every fund's going to be different in terms of what they're looking for with regards to how much preclinical data and at what stage they would jump in and invest. I would say there's no must. It's all about like, are you building a good case for why your approach is compelling? In vitro data is sufficient to get an investment. I've seen plenty of companies raise on unlimited in vitro data, and then they're raising to get that in vivo proof of concept data. And then there's funds that won't invest until they see that critical in vivo data that perfect translatable model. Like if sometimes it's dogs and that's expensive, right? And takes a lot of time. And so it's fund to fund dependent. And there's no really hard and fast rule. As long as you are building a good, compelling case for why your science and your approach is interesting, I think that's sufficient.
Okay, great. And then another person wrote in and asked, is there a good way to address the topic of patient compliance as a risk factor? Them actually doing what they're supposed to do as far as the product that's being developed.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's definitely a concern when we start thinking through what that clinical trial will look like. And so I would be upfront about that risk in that field that you're talking about, right? I mentioned that patient compliance has been an issue historically, and then talk about ways that you're trying to mitigate it, even if it's just we are talking to folks who conduct clinical research in this field and trying to figure out the best ways that they approach patient compliance. That's a good answer, because at least you're trying to work towards a solution. Some companies, people are developing apps to track patients. There's like a whole slew of solutions. I think being upfront about that risk is probably the most important thing you can do. Is essentially when we go and we start to do our diligence on your company, we will come across that issue with regards to clinical trials, and we will potentially, it could be enough of a risk where we wouldn't invest. That's why, if there are risks that you understand and you are aware of, bring them up, talk about how you're trying to mitigate them. Better to hear it from you than it is for us to discover it on our own and come to our own conclusions.
Good point. Yes, right. So we have another question for you, Margalit. For preclinical data, other than having an MD, PhD advisor and supporting your claims, how else can someone increase their credibility / proof of concept to get, it says higher evaluation, but I wonder if just what they're asking for is saying, yes, this, proving my preclinical data actually does mean something. So You may have a better understanding of that question.
I think is this truly the translatable model? Is this relevant? Is this interesting? So I think Ajay mentioned this earlier. We are not experts in every field, right? Even though I have a PhD in neuro, and my first projects to diligence at OUP were oncology. And so I had to go and get smart on the different models that are being used, what's a meaningful improvement in these models, and so on. And so we talked to key opinion leaders to find that out. If you can provide us with folks to talk to, that helps. But you don't have to. I'd say I do look to people's scientific advisory board sometimes to see if there are folks on the scientific advisory board who are also experts in that field that I can go talk to and ask how relevant or meaningful is this data. It's really about just validating with others. I know that I think that's what you're trying to avoid, but at the end of the day, that's how we do our diligence. Providing papers sometimes helps. So I worked in a few in vivo animal models in CNS, and there were papers that talked about describing the different models and how relevant and translatable they are. That helps. Benchmarks for comparison. So this is what this other company is doing, and here's their preclinical data, and here's mine, and mine is I have a larger effect. That's relevant and interesting and helps validate the effect. Even the fact that another company is using those same in vitro and in vivo models and assays to do the work is validating that those are the right models and assays to use. So there are I guess you can look to comparisons, but at the end of the day, we will try to talk to other experts in the field to validate. And so if you provide those experts, great. If not, that's okay too. We will find folks to talk to.
And then one more question, and actually, again, we have two other questions in the wings, but we're going to answer them later. Can we provide other published literature from other people to support claims? And I believe the answer is yes, but I just want to
100%.
100%. Great. Great. Thank you. All right. I think we are good to go on now to the next slide.
Yeah, definitely. And so in regards to, so after showing the product, I think it's important to illustrate your product roadmap. And what I'm particularly looking for on the tech side is evidence that you've created features or thought about new features that are rooted in user discovery. So sometimes technical founders or the founders of the company tend to focus on what might be cool or what might be value added, but I think it's important to create and prioritize features that users actually want, your end users need, et cetera. So I'm really looking for the logic behind each of the pieces of features that you're going to add over time, and what does that mean for acquiring more customers? Next slide, please. On top of that, this really depends on the stage of your business, and fundamentally what we're looking for is to invest in the business instead of a research project. So having thought out a revenue plan, an idea, a way to make money is what distinguishes a research project and an investable company. And so there's not a correct answer, but thinking about how you would go to market would be essential. So are you going directly to end users? So are you cold calling? Are you using your connections to be connected with the right individuals to sell your product? Or are you going through the channel route? Are you considering like a razor model, like a razor blade model, a Gillette model? That's what they call. Are you going to sell the cartridge? Are you going to land and expand? Are you going to sell a product for a small amount and then add features to increase that price? There are so many ways of trying to make money. What we're looking for is that you've thought of it and that you're going to experiment with different models. And truly, I've talked to so many people, especially in business school, like pricing is really hard. You don't really know what people are going to pay for until you ask. And so sometimes you might price it way too low, and that's okay. It's just about getting validation for the product and idea over time. And so we want to think about, okay, what pricing are you thinking about? Are you going for a recurring element? Are you non-recurring? What part of it is non-recurring? What are the unit economics? How are you going to make money over time? And what do you expect to be sales? Like, how do you expect to ramp up over time? And we know that most of it's going to go up to the right, but how is more important.
I'd add on the life science side for therapeutics. For pricing, generally we'll look to what other similar drugs or devices are being reimbursed for. And so it's good to know that even as an early stage company that's doesn't have a great sense of like what even the regulatory path might be and is still working out some details, but just even knowing what that price could potentially be from payers is good to have.
Great. Competition. So as an associate, as I'm building a case to invest in your startup, I'm going to look for analogous companies, like what companies out there are similar in approach. And I think it shows a great sense of self-awareness to understand like who you're competing with. And more so when you're talking to customers, like who are they referencing is important as well. So there's two different ways of going about it. You can have a descriptive approach, which is just giving information about the different companies that you consider competitors, or you can get more comparative. So what features separate you, or what technological features where you're 10x better than them in a certain manner. And there's going to be some bias clearly in these sections, but it's once again, if you've learned anything from this pitch deck, it's learning how you think and how you're positioning your company and your product and your team to essentially capture the market. And so I would describe the competitive landscape as detailed as possible because you'll save me time. What are the relevant metrics and how do you compare them? Are you growing faster than them? Do you have a technology that's 10x superior, faster, cheaper? What are the barriers of entry for your particular product? So you do have some kind of core IP that cannot be replicated for many years, and you have some kind of unique insight based on research you spent 5 years doing. what is really proprietary and what's going to make you stand out. And every investor will want to get kind of an idea. In some cases, it might be a total blue ocean strategy, meaning that you've created something fundamentally different. And I think what you could do in those cases is sort of compare the approach of what everyone else is doing right now, even if it's a totally different technology. And so I think this will help investors get up to speed faster.
Next slide. Yeah. And then so for the life science side, you definitely want to talk to the current standard of care and anything approved, but that's not the end of the story when we assess the competitive landscape. So when describing the entire landscape, you should also search for anything in clinical and preclinical development for this specific indication or target as well, because these other competitors that are still in development may get approved before your technology and essentially create a new baseline that you have to kind of rise above or come up right behind you and steal market share, since all of this takes so long to develop. And then at the end of it, you want to highlight why your approach is the best over all of these competitors. We will do our own internal sort of competitive landscape diligence, but coming to us up front with this information in your pitch deck, again, as Ajay mentioned, shows that you are aware of the market and that you are cognizant of why you can kind of beat out the rest and why your approach is the best approach to go with. Next slide. So the financing strategy is important too. You want to just make sure you are focusing on value creating milestones and outline how long it will take to achieve those milestones. So for life science, we really care about how long it will take you to get to your therapeutic to like a clinical trial, or maybe like an important preclinical milestone, because at the end of the day, we really view the clinical trial data as the real test of whether your approach will work or not. And can be a means for an acquisition or transaction. So it's that phase 2 trial that is the true proof of concept data. And you want to make sure you are focusing on the right de-risking experiments and steps prior to getting there. So some scientific experiments are interesting and would make nice papers, but are not truly de-risking for the technology. So one example I came across recently was a proposal to do in vitro work in organoids and then in vivo later on. So while the organoid work is interesting and may provide some additional proof of concept work for that particular application, it wasn't truly de-risking. The real test is the in vivo work. So it's worth sort of reevaluating whether some of the experiments you have planned out are really necessary in your overall financing strategy. And it's if you happen to know how much each step will cost, you can include that in sort of like a high level budget to get to each milestone on this slide as well. But again, not the most necessary component to have every piece of your budget worked out in this initial pitch. Next slide. And then the financing strategy flows well after that milestone slide. This should break down the plan for your current raise in much more detail. And define what the ask is really designed to do. So how much are you raising and what milestones will you accomplish with this raise? You want to make sure your raise gets you to a value creation milestone, meaning that when you are done with the money, you will be able to raise your next round at a much higher valuation because you accomplished X, Y, and Z, and those specific experiments and data points are significantly de-risking to the technology and the approach. You can talk about how much you've raised previously. If you have raised around already, if it's not on the slide, we'll ask essentially, and try to be realistic about your future costs and revenues with regards to valuations, what your company is worth. So you should be comfortable allowing the market to decide. You can look up comps in the space for other companies to give you a rough idea, but be cognizant of the fact that you don't know all the data and insight that company had to garner that specific valuation that you're seeing as a comparison. So if a VC you are talking to, we like to just emphasize, to highlight this, is just asks you what your valuation expectations are, just tell them you'll let the market decide. I think that's the most fair answer. Essentially, they are trying to find out how price sensitive you are. When you get to the point where you are negotiating and they intend to give you a term sheet, it's okay to be more upfront about your expectations, but initial conversations don't require you to give a number, and potentially is better if you just leave that vague and just let them know that you are cognizant of whatever the market is, and you would like the market to help you determine what that valuation should be. Next slide. Okay, and to finish up, you should speak to what the company aspires to be. So this is kind of the parallel to what that introductory slide is. It sort of ends your presentation with sort of an overview of what the key points are to remember. So things you can highlight. So like, is this an AI drug discovery company with multiple internal therapeutic programs 5 years in the future? Or is it going to be a service-based company with pharma partnership? Like, what's that large vision that you're looking to achieve here? And what does success look like in the next 5 years? It's good to summarize the key features of your company too on this slide, like the example on the left. So it will help investors walk away with those key points they should remember about your company. On the same point, it's a nice place to summarize and sort of bullet form what your ask is, what milestones you hope to achieve. Important to note, like when we discuss the deal internally, we start with these features, like what's interesting about the company and what are the key financing details. So why not put them all on one slide right at the end to help highlight those important points so that the investor you're talking to walks away with all those important points to discuss. And if you finish your pitch with a few minutes to spare and there are no more questions, please feel free to ask the person you're pitching to for feedback. It will only help you either develop the pitch further or even just understand like what they're looking for and what points they're picking out that there could be of concern or points that they're interested in. I'll say some folks won't give you feedback on the spot, but they are generally happy to follow up with feedback if you ask them to after they've had time to review the opportunity. And then definitely ask about next steps too. That will help you understand what their process looks like and what to expect moving forward. Next slide.
Actually, I'm gonna just pause right there because we have a bunch of questions to get through in the next 5 minutes. Actually, so we only have a couple minutes, but hopefully people can stay on us a little bit longer. So Ajay, first to you. Prior to a pitch deck or as background to a pitch deck submission, how much do you weigh discovery programs like NSF's iCore in kind of helping you decide, is this potentially going to be of interest to us? And then also there's a second part to this question, but that's the first part that I'll ask.
Yeah, I think it's a strong sign, especially if you don't have entrepreneurial experience before. It's a structured program that'll just help you get into the habit of putting yourself out there to find customers. However, it doesn't replace the idea. Like I've had individuals pitch me that I've spoken to 100 people and I've gone through the NSF iCore, but the reality is that's not necessarily always enough to get an investment. It's part of your process. You still have to build a product, build a team out, and identify. Now that you've identified how much people are willing to pay, you have to ideally you solve those problems as much as possible. And so I would say it's a good sign, but it's not the end all be all.
Okay, great. And I'm going to get to the second part of the question, but in the meantime, actually, Katie's going to be putting in the chat for everyone a link to our survey. You'll also receive this as you exit the webinar because I know we're coming up on our time. So the second part of the question, Ajay, is can you recommend any other online free self-paced, self-guided discovery programs comparable to iCore? Is there something else that out there and something that we can also follow up with afterwards with people?
Yeah. I think two things that come to mind is like, YC Startup School. I think they have some sections on describing the basic mechanics of startups as well as identifying customers. I think it's within the first two videos. A more academic brush that I like is what's his name? I think it's like Discipline Entrepreneurship 24 Steps. It's by Bill Allett from the Martin Trust Center at MIT. He kind of has an entire guide about how to identify your customers and what are the right steps. Like it's as structured as you can get, but the reality is you can't follow every step, and meaning you'll have a successful startup. But I think that's a good framework.
Great, thanks. Margalit, is it true that VCs are more interested in rare diseases than common diseases because it's easier to get FDA approval? And then there's a second part to this. It says, if so, that means even the treatment, if it's for common disease, should we brand as targeting a rare version of a common disease?
Okay, so it all depends. It's not that we're more interested in rare versus common. It's about what the clinical trial challenges, what are the risks involved in going after some of those common diseases. I mean, the example I always like to give people is for Alzheimer's disease. We would love to fund the drug that helps slow progression or stop progression of Alzheimer's disease. That is a huge market and a huge unmet need. However, there are a lot of clinical trial complications involved in going after Alzheimer's disease, a very heterogeneous patient population, differing degrees of disease progression. All of that, no good biomarkers really to assess whether something's working and whether it's not and going to improve cognition. So all of that makes it very challenging to go after Alzheimer's disease. So what a lot of neuro companies do that are doing neurodegeneration, they will go after a rare disease that is their specific target is implicated in. You have a smaller patient population that hopefully you can easily identify, right? So you maybe some genetic marker that allows you to pick patients, or the diagnosis is a lot clearer than it is in Alzheimer's disease. Hopefully faster progressing disease. So your trial, instead of being 5 years, is 6 months to a year, and you can tell if your drug is working within that shorter time frame. And then some of these rare diseases also have huge unmet needs. Like there are just no therapeutics available for them. And so that's still like a very interesting opportunity for us to go and help these patients and potentially have a drug that works for them. And then the idea is that if it works in this smaller patient population, maybe it will work in the larger Alzheimer's disease population. But that is just that is a population that comes with a lot more investment risk. And so that's why sometimes it feels like we prefer the rare diseases versus some of the common diseases. But we would love, again, to find the therapeutic or device that works for these common diseases. There just needs a lot of those risks associated with going after some of those larger indications need to be addressed up front. And that is really challenging for a lot of approaches.
Okay, great. Ajay, do the companies get to dictate whether they want a safe, or is it the investor, or is it mutual?
I think it's market demand. So it comes from the founders in the space, the timing of entrepreneurship in general. And it just depends on the stage of the company as well. I've seen it both ways. Like it's just a way to defer pricing around if you're not necessarily sure or committed on what you can get in the market. And so it's a simple and clean way of doing it. And I think YC is really pushed for it.
Okay, great. Margalit, can you just talk a little bit about timing and fund life cycle with regards to VCs and when you're approaching your VC, what that means for them?
Yeah. So the life of a fund is 10 years. So we have essentially anywhere from you can think of it, just split it in half. So like 5 years to invest it and 5 years to realize it. So we spend the first part of the fund investing out the capital that we have, and then the second half of the fund, hopefully realizing those investments and exiting these companies. So when we're assessing an opportunity, we are looking to see if we can get to an exit within that 10-year time frame. And that doesn't mean you have a full 10 years. If we started investing out of our fund in, let's say, like OUP3 has started investing out of it in 2019, we are looking to see exits before 2029. And 2029, hopefully the latest. Sometimes there's a little bit of a cushion at the end. So maybe a couple of years afterwards, there's still a little bit of opportunity to exits. But we are really evaluating the opportunity within that time frame. And so when you get to year 4 or year 5 let's go with year 4 of the fund life, some funds will stop looking at earlier opportunities, like early seed opportunities, therapeutics without a development candidate, because they know that if there's no development candidate now, there's no way they're going to get to an exit in the next 6 years. And so it's good to be aware of the fund the life cycle of the fund that the investor you're talking to is investing out of. And it's good to just be aligned with regards to that. The last thing you want is to have an investor give you capital expecting you to exit in 5 years when your exit is 7 or 8 years out, because what's going to happen is that investor is going to start pushing you to exit sooner, and maybe you haven't realized the full value of your technology or the full value of your therapeutic, and you're going to be misaligned in that regard. So fair question to ask an investor.
Yeah. And that was actually my question is like, how much this has actually come up in conversation with the investors? Like, is it something that like you just kind of need to know, or is it something that you actually discuss with them?
We recommend that people ask. It's not something that I will admit, when I'm the majority of pitches that I've taken, people don't ask, but it is a fair question to ask. Like when did you start investing out of the fund, and when does the fund life end for this specific fund?
And to quickly add to that, it's also fair to ask to go into more detail about our investment process, like who needs to be on the call, and as well as the fund timing. So those all are fair questions, and then also shows you get to control the process a little bit more and define fit. And so we recommend asking this.
Great. We still have a number of questions to get through. Thanks for everyone who has actually stuck on with us. We are recording all this. If you have to drop off, you'll be able to see this later. How important is an FTO analysis, a freedom to operate analysis? Universities themselves don't usually have the resources to spend on an FTO. Ajay, do you want to go with this first, and then Margalit?
I'm
actually not familiar with FTO.
I don't think handle it. So we look at IP and we ask about IP, but we are generally not doing that IP diligence process until, at least on the life science side, it's the lead investor will do a full IP diligence with their attorneys that they've selected, and share that out to the syndicate if there is a syndicate, or share it with whoever else is co-investing. So it's nice to know, and I think if what you're working on is particularly contentious, you might want to consider looking into doing something that's not an expensive full out one, but I think there are versions. There's like just searching for prior art and just to show that you actually looked a little bit. But a full FTO and a full IP diligence will be done by the lead investor before they put any dollars in. So you don't have to worry about it so much.
Yeah.
And then on the life science side, also to add, a lot of the IP that comes from the university or the initial IP gets developed upon, and then the actual IP that's relevant to the company and the technology is developed later on. And so we assess IP, but we don't put a lot of weight onto what that initial IP is unless there's something contentious about it.
All right. Well, so we have a couple of questions here on timing. And I'm going to ask this of each of you, because I'm wondering actually if there's any difference between the life science and the tech side for us. So for an intro meeting, what is the ideal time? And then for the full pitch, what are the ideal times? And someone's asking here for several examples, like the best length of that pitch. So one person says, we've been initially doing 30 minutes for those intro meetings, but they're really tight sometimes. Should we do an hour, 45 minutes? Ajay, do you want to go first? And
Really? Yeah, I personally prefer 45 minutes for the example, also to get rid of any kind of anxiety of the timing as well. And I try to be considerate because I've been in your shoes before. And so that's just my take. And not every investor will give you that time, but I think you can always ask for it and then see how it goes from there. So I would shoot 45 minutes to an hour, and you can always end it shorter. It's hard to add time. And so I think that's a pretty good step, because the main goal is to get to the next step of the diligence process. So for OUP, it would be an initial conversation with an associate and then the broader team call. And so you want to generate enough interest to get to that next step. And so I think half an hour is pretty tight, but I think 45 minutes to an hour sounds about right.
That's for that intro meeting. Then for the full pitch, most of the ones I've seen are an hour, but sometimes can go over. So, okay. All right. Margalit, any difference for you?
About the same. There's something that my PhD advisor used to tell me, that I was like, you should be able to talk about your PhD work and dissertation in like a minute, or you should be able to expound upon it for hours. And so like I would aim for 45 minutes. I think that is ideal. Gives enough time for questions, because questions will happen throughout the hour-long pitch, but be prepared to have to give it in 20 minutes if 30 minutes is all that investor is giving you, or even 15 minutes. just be aware that it might get shorted. An hour is generally pretty common for a pitch call. And again, just leave a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah. Ajay, will VCs invest in a company if they have invested in a competitor?
I think it depends on their policy. I've seen it both ways. So we may be more open to it, but in some cases, certain investors, if they invested in that, like a photonics company, they won't do it. So it's case by case.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of I know a lot of potentially walls in place to help that and actually make the companies themselves feel comfortable with that. And it's just a matter of talking with investors, I think, often on that. Margalit, anything you want to add on that?
No, that exactly. It really just depends on the fund and where their interests are and what they're doing at the moment. So,
all right, a couple more questions, and we'll get to our summary slide. You mentioned that let the market decide on valuation. However, don't investors value companies themselves? Margalit, you want to go?
Yeah, so we do, but we look to the market to help value it. And I would also just make sure you've looked to the market, because investors might try to go a little lower, and you have an opportunity to negotiate that valuation. So don't take it as just the investors are deciding and that's it. Like you do have there's moments to negotiate it. And so knowing what that market value really is will help give you the information you need to negotiate.
The more investors you speak to, the more bargaining power you have, and the term sheet is non-binding, so you can technically talk to as many investors and try to get the right fit and right price that meets your needs.
Yeah.
All right, last one, Margalit. What is a development candidate?
So the development candidate is so in therapeutics, it's really what the drug you are going to take forward into hopefully clinical trials. I mean, that doesn't mean that's the end all be all, but it's usually the one you're going to put the most capital into to do a lot more of the next steps for drug development to get it to clinical trial, like your IND enabling studies and everything before then. And so generally companies will go through a series of, I don't know, hundreds to thousands of different small molecule compounds, or sometimes you can assess multiple antibodies with different sequences and different affinities and things like that, and do some engineering to try to get the affinities better. But at some point, you have to make a decision. This is the one I am moving forward with, and this is the one I'm going to put the chunk of capital I need to put into to get it to a clinical trial. And so you just have, it's when you decide. So knowing that you've decided on that is a de-risking step, because it means you've assessed a lot of other stuff before then. And so we can look at that data. We can see like that this is truly the best person. This is the best compound to go forward with.
And what is the term of art for med tech? That's the next question. And I don't think you used the term necessarily development candidate. You use, we're not as involved in that area. So
we're not. I mean, generally people will talk about like prototypes and things, yeah. And then, so getting a prototype and then kind of finalizing what that, right. You do have to, at some point, you do finalize your device that you're moving forward with into clinical trials as well. I don't know what the term is actually.
All right. So sorry, I did move it to the last slide, and then we'll go to our final slide that shows our contact information. And I'll give a summary there, but this is yours, Margalit, I think.
Yeah. So just to sum it all up, that's all the stuff you have to put that we think is important to put in your pitch deck. So really, it's kind of a lot. But I think what's important to remember, there's sort of no one size fits all. That's all the information we kind of look for when we're going through a deck. Some people put a little less, some people put a little bit more, but the more clearly you can put all that information into a deck helps us evaluate the opportunity and get us excited and interested in what you're doing. So I think the thing to take away from the presentation is just, you want to be clear, state the problem that you're trying to solve, why your team and technology can do this better than anyone else out there, and why you guys can be successfully reach this goal, right? And then back all that up with facts and data, like as whatever facts and data you need to tell the story clearly and concisely. And then just to highlight, I mean, great pitchers not only sell how exciting their product and company are, they ground it all in reality. So be modest and be honest about what you're selling us and what you're trying to get us excited about, but bring that passion and make us feel that as well. And then always make sure you understand who your audience is, right? And what information they need to walk away with from the pitch. So one thing that I think we were talking about the intro pitch versus like the larger group pitch. Sometimes that could be different depending on who's in the room, right? And so like for the intro pitch, you want to talk about the entire opportunity, and then we generally have folks talk to our life science team as a whole, and then we want them to really focus in on the science, and then we'll have them talk to our investment team as a whole. And at that point, we want them to go back and sort of talk more about the management team running it, the strategy of the company. And so like just know who's in the room and what points you should be speaking to. That also really helps. And that's, happy to answer any more questions if any others came up.
No more yet, but I'm really, first of all, I want to thank our audience for sticking with us for so long. A lot of people did. I know we went over our time. Like I said, we will be sending out the slides as well as a recording of this afterwards. We do have our contact information on here if anyone wants to follow up with us with any questions that maybe were not answered during the webinar. We did put in the survey into the chat box, but that should also be coming to you as you exit out of this. We really do appreciate everyone completing the survey, as this does actually help us in the future plan our webinars and what topics are of interest to our audience. So, and lastly, I'd like to thank Ajay and Margalit for your time and your shared expertise today. I think this was a terrific presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.